Imagine a leaden coffin lying hidden beneath the cold stones of Westminster Abbey. There are no inscriptions to reveal its secrets, only stone silence and the weight of a history carefully contained. More than 4 centuries have passed, and yet what rests there is not merely the body of a queen. It is a decision, a pact between state, church and memory to seal away forever what could not be allowed to see the light. Upon that lead lies the myth of the Virgin Queen, polished by portraits and sermons. Beneath it the flesh that once ached, bled and resisted lying down as if sleep itself were a surrender. Before the tomb there was a room Richmond, velvet curtains drawn against the dawn candles flickering, shadows dancing and her attendants holding their breath. In those last hours Elizabeth ceased to belong to herself, even her dying body had become a national relic. Her ladies moved softly trained in the liturgy of details, warm cloths, vials of scented water, silver, spoons that could no longer moisten cracked lips. The Queen refused to lie in her bed. She stood or sat as though reclining would mean submission. Her eyes wide open, fixed on something no one else could see. Her face was a mask more enduring than any proclamation the chalk-white veneer of Caruso that had hidden stains and fevers for decades, lead and vinegar, etched into her very skin. Beneath the brocade, the whalebone corset that had carried her upright before ambassadors now whispered its own testimony, bruises, distortions, and the silent toll of obedience. The room itself seemed to hold its breath. Each candle was a fragile border between life and shadow, each creak of wood a note in an unspoken dirge. Physicians no longer dictated the moment, they were witnesses only. Those present had long ago mastered the economy of silence, when to look away, when to bury a rumour, when to let myth devour truth. Someone dabbed her face with a damp cloth. As so many times before, the white mask peeled away in strips like old paint from a damp wall. Beneath it was no monster, no sin, just human fragility. And yet no one spoke of it. To name it would be to begin unearthing what the realm had sworn to bury. Elizabeth had made her body into a stage and her court into an audience. In public armour over silk, in private silk over wounds. To her people she was light, unbroken navigation speeches, the thunder of Tilbury. But in that dark chamber at Richmond she revealed her last method, walking the knife edge between what is shown and what is hidden. Her virginity, politicized into sacrament, had made her body a theological frontier. England, she declared, was her husband. To confess decay now was to risk not just scandal but schism. Every attendant knew it. Their queen's weakness was not medical, it was political dynamite. Footsteps rustled in the corridor. Messengers waited ready to gallop toward London with the sanctioned version of events. Not the small private truth of cracked skin and exhausted lungs, but the grander truth that states cultivate order, continuity, calm. The air reeked of melting wax and perfumes trying to suppress another scent raw and unignorable. One lady briefly recalled her sovereign's portrait, still fresh, still glowing. Pearls at her throat, a painted sun behind her. She knew that image would outlive the woman gasping before her. Perhaps that is why when Elizabeth murmured half verses in Latin, no one called a doctor. They heard symbols, not symptoms. It is said Elizabeth passed her final night standing, refusing her bed as though it were a trap. Each time her legs gave way, she demanded to rise again. Death must come on her terms, like governance itself. Against the curtain, her shadow no longer resembled the flawless oval of her portraits. It fractured into angles. Courtiers had turned her face into the map of a triumphant England. Now the map revealed storm. When at last her corset was unlaced, the air filled with a sudden ancient stench, as though history itself had begun to corrode. No one cried aloud. Protocol had no room for such music. Objects in that room carried memory. Mirrors covered in cloth remembered orders never to reflect decay. Gloves remembered trembling hands after audiences. Even the bed remembered rejection, a queen who would not recline, because sleep looked too much like surrender. Outside the Thames rolled on. London still dreamed of an unbroken monarch. By morning, heralds would stride through the streets with words like peace, glory, grace. None of those words fit this room. Here there were only shallow breaths, whispered saints' names, and the shared knowledge that as soon as her flame guttered out, the machinery of myth would ignite. Why so much detail of the chamber, so little of diagnoses? Because by this stage Elizabeth's body was not hers, it was a metaphor. Medicine might have suspected slow poisoning from cosmetics, organ failure from age and strain. But these were details without power. The image of eternal sovereignty mattered more. While her heart faltered, the council sharpened their quills. Orders to bishops, scripts of proclamation, the choreography of grief all waited just beyond dawn. Before the coffin was sealed, the narrative had to be. When her breath thinned to a thread and the thread finally snapped, there was no drama, only candles shrinking in silence. The hands that moved then knew their role, removed jewels, cover, cleanse, cover again. That face, once an icon, gave its last private performance. The white mask tried to serve its function even at the end to protect her. Yet the cruel irony lingered. The same substance that crowned her beauty now stripped her face in brittle sheets. Who had the courage to look? Perhaps none. Perhaps all and each silently vowed that nothing would be spoken beyond these walls. Lead that night began its work, not only as burial material but as policy. Lead coffins preserve odours, shut out air, deny time its usual disclosures. Lead is the enemy of curiosity. If an ordinary grave centuries later yields evidence to science, a leaden one refuses. That refusal was essential. In an age where monarchs' bodies were read as divine verdicts, Elizabeth's corpse could not become a text. It must remain a reliquary, not a riddle. So the kingdom would risk silence rather than revelation. And yet a question was born, not buried. What truth was sealed away? Was lead a shield against malice or a wall against history? Those who swore secrecy, doctors, maids, clerks, knew that their queen's image was more fragile than stone and more useful than armies. They had seen through decades of fire and conspiracy how a sovereign's body could spark war. Better to make it untouchable than debatable. Thus, before the sun rose, the funeral had already begun. Thus began a long age of unanswered questions. If we could hear a voiceover in that chamber, it would remind us the mask was not mere vanity. It was strategy. For a woman encircled by enemies both seen and unseen, appearance became fortress. There was no room for private weakness without public cost, and it would leave us with the question that threads through this tale: did Elizabeth choose the mask, or did the mask choose her? Beneath lead, that question remains intact. When the chamber door closed, the order went out, seal the coffin. A smith would hammer it shut so that no temptation could pry it open. Westminster awaited its queen as it had many others, with solemnity reserved for the divine and the political at once. The stones themselves had no curiosity, but we do. And so we return to that image, a lead coffin beneath Westminster, still as judgment. Inside lies not just a queen, but the proof that sometimes a nation chooses salvation in myth rather than truth. And the question that summons us now is this: what price was paid for that choice, and who continues to pay it? Before we continue, leave a like and subscribe. Only if it truly feels natural. And now softly tell me, where are you listening from? The story of Elizabeth does not begin in the twilight at Richmond, nor even with her coronation in 1558. It begins in a furnace once stoked by Civil War dynastic ambition and the hunger of kings to make their blood appear sacred. The Tudors were not born in marble halls. They clawed their way onto the throne through battlefields stained with the residue of the Wars of the Roses. Henry VII, the founder of the dynasty, had to justify his rule with both sword and ceremony. His marriage to Elizabeth of York fused two warring houses, Lancaster and York, but the peace was uneasy, a scar barely stitched. From the start, the Tudor line carried within it the knowledge that legitimacy is fragile, a mask that must be maintained as fiercely as any army mustered. Henry VIII inherited that lesson. He was no mere monarch of leisure, but a man consumed by an obsession to secure a male heir who could preserve what his father had won. Dynastic continuity was his theology, his obsession, and ultimately his undoing. His first queen, Catherine of Aragon, gave him only a daughter, Mary. Years passed, hopes for a son flickered and died, and with them the king's patience. It was not merely personal disappointment, it was dynastic terror. The throne rested on shaky foundations, and the thought of leaving it to a single woman in an age where rulers were measured by armies and heirs filled Henry with dread. Into this crucible stepped Anne Boleyn. Brilliant, sharp-tongued, and politically dangerous, she was more than a mistress. She was the wedge Henry drove between England and Rome. When the Pope refused to annul his marriage to Catherine, Henry declared himself the supreme head of the Church of England. It was a seismic act that severed centuries of obedience to Rome. Behind that decision lay lust, ambition, and fear. A queen's body had become the battlefield of theology, and an unborn child the potential saviour of a dynasty. In 1533, when Anne gave birth at Greenwich, anticipation was feverish. The bells of London were ready to toll for a prince, but when the midwives raised the swaddled infant, it was not a boy. It was a girl, Elizabeth. What should have been triumph curdled into unease. Henry masked his disappointment with forced proclamations of joy, but everyone in court knew the dynasty's foundations trembled again. Elizabeth's birth was marked not with rejoicing, but with whispers. Could a daughter truly anchor a kingdom in an age when women were dismissed as fragile vessels, unfit to wield swords or crowns? The very air of Greenwich Palace seemed heavy with doubt. Elizabeth's cradle was thus set amid fires both political and theological. She was the child of a king who defied Rome and a queen who would soon face the axe. Her bloodline was both weapon and wound. Supporters of Catherine called her illegitimate, a bastard child of adultery. Loyalists to Anne paraded her as the herald of a New England. Even before she learned to walk, Elizabeth was entangled in a struggle, older and larger than herself, the battle over England's soul, whether Catholic or Protestant, submissive to Rome, or sovereign unto itself. Anne's fate taught Elizabeth her first lesson in survival. Within 3 years of her daughter's birth, Anne Boleyn was accused of adultery and treason charges most historians believe were fabricated by her enemies. She was condemned and beheaded. In May 1536, her memory reduced to whispers and ashes. Elizabeth, not yet 3 years old, was declared illegitimate. The daughter of a disgraced mother, branded with stigma, she was stripped of her rank and cast aside. Her world shifted overnight from a cradle of promise to the shadow of disgrace. And yet in this crucible of instability, the child absorbed something more enduring than loss. She learned that survival required silence, that blood could be both curse and shield, and that identity was never secure but must be performed, defended, reshaped. She was not yet queen, not even a secure princess, but already her very existence was a rehearsal for the role she would play all her life. Surrounded by the ghosts of a civil war, by courtiers who measured every smile, by theologians who thundered against her mother's marriage, Elizabeth grew up with the understanding that her body, her name, her destiny were all contested ground. The Tudor origin story is therefore not a prologue but a prophecy. Born from a king's defiance and a queen's downfall, Elizabeth carried the scars of instability in her very blood. The England that awaited her was fractured between Catholic and Protestant, between loyalty and rebellion, between memory and myth. From her earliest breath, she was forced to learn what would become her most enduring skill to live, as though the floor beneath her might crack at any moment, and to balance on it with the poise of a dancer. Her survival instincts were not gifts of maturity, but legacies of birth roots in blood and fire planted before she could even speak her own name. Elizabeth's earliest memories were not of stability, but of shifting titles and rooms that seemed to dissolve beneath her feet. She began her life as a celebrated princess daughter of a king who had defied the Pope, wrapped in silken promise. Yet after her mother's execution, she was reclassified, with a stroke of the quill, from Princess Elizabeth to Lady Elizabeth. That single word was more than formality. It was a public branding, a demotion that signalled to all England that she was no longer the heir of triumph, but the child of disgrace. Even as a toddler, she absorbed the fragility of status. One day she was cherished, the next she was a political liability, a bastard whose legitimacy was argued in pulpits and whispered about in council chambers. Her childhood was a game of constant relocation. From palace to manor, from one noble household to another, Elizabeth grew up in spaces where she was both guest and prisoner. Every host was appointed by her father, every servant aware that the smallest report could shape the girl's future. Even her toys and tutors were filtered through politics. This was no nursery of laughter and freedom, but a school of vigilance. The walls of her rooms were hung with tapestries, but they might as well have been woven from watchful eyes. Every gesture, every word could be observed, reported, and twisted. The Tudor court itself was a stage, a theatre of masks in which survival depended on performance. Children, even royal ones, learned early that silence could be safer than speech, that a smile could conceal as much as a frown could reveal. Elizabeth understood this instinctively. Where others babbled freely, she learned the weight of pause. Where others sought affection recklessly, she rationed her trust. She began to master the subtle art of ambiguity, not lying outright, but never exposing the whole of herself. It was a skill taught not by tutors, but by the constant reminder that her life could turn on the suspicion of treason whispered into the wrong ear. Even her half-siblings were less family than threats. Mary, her elder sister, looked upon her with suspicion as the living emblem of their father's break with Catherine of Aragon and Rome. Later Edward, her younger half-brother, would briefly sit on the throne as a Protestant hope, but his reign was too short to secure her future. Elizabeth lived between them like a pawn that might at any moment be sacrificed. The siblings were not raised together in warmth, but separated, shaped by factions that looked at Elizabeth less as a girl and more as a symbol to be deployed or destroyed. This atmosphere bred in her a discipline few children could endure. She learned to sit still, to listen more than she spoke, to study the movements of others before committing to her own. To the untrained eye, she might appear demure, even passive, but beneath that stillness was calculation. Even as a child, she grasped that survival lay in becoming unreadable. If her enemies could not predict her, they could not condemn her. She built a shield of composure and armour made of restraint. There are stories, perhaps embellished by those who later admired her, of Elizabeth mastering languages with unnatural speed, of dazzling her tutors with wit. Whether wholly true or not, the core is clear. She understood that knowledge was the one possession no faction could strip away. Books became her allies, words her sanctuary. Yet even here she was careful. She displayed brilliance but never arrogance, curiosity but never defiance. Every lesson was filtered through the same rule that governed her movements in the household: appear obedient but never so pliant that you can be broken. In such an environment, childhood was less a season of innocence than a rehearsal for monarchy. Elizabeth became an actress trained by necessity. The courtiers around her shifted roles daily one week, flattering her the next, undermining her. She watched, she remembered, she learned, and in learning she fashioned the core of what would later define her reign. When illness struck in adulthood, when her body betrayed her with fevers and weakness, she would lean on the habits forged here: the art of the mask, the discipline of silence, the ability to turn stillness into strength. Elizabeth's childhood was not simply marked by instability, it was sculpted by it. The princess-turned-bastard grew into a girl who understood that her life was a stage, her words lines in a script she did not write but had to perform with precision. In that theatre of masks, she discovered the most essential survival skill of all: to let others project what they wanted to see while she kept the truth locked behind eyes that gave nothing away. When Mary Tudor, the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, ascended the throne in 1553, Elizabeth's life became a coin tossed in the air, spinning between survival and annihilation. To Mary's Catholic supporters, Elizabeth was not just a younger half-sister, she was living proof of the schism Henry VIII had carved between England and Rome. Her very existence recalled Anne Boleyn, the woman many considered a usurper and heretic. To the Protestants, Elizabeth was a beacon, a rallying point of hope. For Mary, caught between rebellion and loyalty, that beacon was also a threat. And in a court where religion and politics were indistinguishable, to be a threat was to be a prisoner in waiting. The years of Mary's reign pressed Elizabeth onto the stage of suspicion. She was interrogated by counsellors who searched her words for treason, questioned about her involvement in uprisings she may never have supported. Each session was a rehearsal in verbal tightrope walking. Too much protestation looked guilty, too much silence looked defiant. Every syllable became dangerous, every breath an audition for life. It was in those exchanges that Elizabeth perfected the poise that later defined her rule: the ability to answer without answering, to cloak truth in ambiguity, to perform sincerity while concealing fear. Then came the Tower of London. Cold, damp, and echoing with the memory of her mother's final walk, it was the most terrifying lesson of her youth. Within those stone walls, Elizabeth knew that many entered, but few emerged. She had no illusions her mother had been executed by a father she had once trusted. How much easier would it be for a half-sister bound to her by little more than suspicion and blood to consign her to the same fate? Each morning might have been her last, each key turning in the lock the prelude to an executioner's steps. The Tower taught her more than fear. It taught her endurance. She learned to preserve her composure under eyes that searched for panic, to craft her body itself into a mask that betrayed nothing. Captivity paradoxically gave Elizabeth a kind of freedom, not freedom of movement, but freedom to study human nature with clarity sharpened by peril. She saw how jailers looked at her with curiosity, pity, or suspicion. She learned which words softened suspicion and which ones sharpened it. She measured the weight of silence, discovering how absence of speech could be louder than argument. In that crucible of surveillance, she understood that survival depended on performance as much as on faith. She could not control her fate, but she could control her image. This lesson would echo for the rest of her life. The mask she wore in the Tower was not made of lead and vinegar. It was made of will and restraint. Later, when illness ravaged her body and cosmetics became her armour, It was not a new habit, but an old one refined. She had already learned that to govern perception was to govern survival. The face she presented to the world, calm, composed, enigmatic, was the continuation of the mask she had practiced in prison. The tower was her first dressing room, its walls, her mirrors, its shadows, her stagehands. Mary's reign passed, but it did not pass gently. The flames of Smithfield consumed Protestant martyrs, and Elizabeth watched with silent calculation. She did not denounce her sister, nor did she embrace Rome. She hovered in a space that was neither loyal nor rebellious, a precarious ambiguity that preserved her. To the devout she was perhaps a secret Protestant. To the crown she was a subdued sister. To herself she was something more subtle, a student of survival, one who knew that masks could be more powerful than swords. By the time the crown came to her in 1558, Elizabeth was not naive. She had lived at the edge of the axe, had heard the hollow footsteps in the tower, had memorized the language of suspicion. The lesson was indelible to leave as queen. She must act as she had as prisoner, measured, masked, composed. She had learned that one could be caged and yet still command perception, and perception in a world where kings and queens were judged as symbols was power itself. In Mary's kingdom, Elizabeth was a prisoner. In her own, she would remain one too, only this time the walls would be made not of stone but of ceremony, paint and ritual. What the tower had begun, the crown would complete. When Elizabeth claimed the crown in November 1558, England was not a kingdom at peace, it was a nation divided, exhausted and watched by enemies abroad. The air in London was heavy with incense and suspicion. Only days earlier, Mary and I had died, leaving behind the acrid smoke of Protestant martyrs and the sour taste of failed Spanish alliances. Across the Channel, France and Spain, two Catholic giants measured England as a weakened prize. At home, Protestants hoped for salvation, Catholics braced for reprisal, and the new queen inherited a throne balanced on fractures that could split open at the slightest misstep. Elizabeth's accession was itself a performance. She rode into London beneath banners proclaiming renewal, her auburn hair unhidden, her face radiant. To her people, the young queen seemed almost a miracle after years of fear. But behind the triumphant pageantry lay a minefield of calculations. The council pressed her immediately with a question that haunted her reign: whom would she marry? In the 16th century, a queen without a husband was a problem, and a queen without an heir was a crisis. Her father's obsession with succession still lingered like a curse. To many, Elizabeth's body was not her own. It was the kingdom's property, a vessel meant to secure continuity. The options were poisoned chalices. A marriage to a foreign prince, perhaps a Habsburg or a Valois, might secure alliances, but would risk making England a pawn in continental wars. The scars of Mary's union with Philip of Spain were still fresh. That match had dragged England into costly conflicts and bred resentment among her subjects. To repeat the experiment would be folly, yet to marry an English noble carried equal danger. Any great lord elevated to king consort would inflame the jealousy of rivals, creating factions that could ignite civil war. No choice was safe. Elizabeth saw the trap with clear eyes. To choose was to divide. To refuse was to unify, at least for a time. And so she began to wield her singleness not as deficiency but as strategy. She announced that she was already married to her kingdom. England was her spouse, her subjects, her children. What might have been interpreted as weakness she transformed into political weaponry. A husband could drag England into foreign wars. Elizabeth alone could keep it sovereign. An heir might have secured succession, but also invited plots. Elizabeth's virginity kept her throne centred on herself, not on a future rival. This weaponized singleness did more than deflect pressure, it created a myth. Courtiers, poets and preachers elevated her virginity into a kind of theology. She became the Virgin Queen, a figure whose body was not simply barren, but sanctified, an emblem of Protestant purity set against Catholic corruption. Every refusal of a suitor became an affirmation of sovereignty. Every courtship was drawn out like theatre, a diplomatic dance in which she allowed foreign kings to hope only to deny them at the last moment, keeping England free from entangling bonds. But this strategy was not without cost. Elizabeth's decision left her vulnerable to endless scrutiny. Ambassadors reported obsessively on her health, her menstrual cycles, her complexion. Every sign of fertility or decay became international news. Her body, already politicized by birth, was now the fulcrum of diplomacy. Yet Elizabeth endured with remarkable control. She understood that ambiguity was power. To promise, to withhold, to delay these became her tools. Where Mary had burned dissenters, Elizabeth smothered rivals in uncertainty. The crown in 1558 was therefore more than a diadem of gold, it was a balancing act of fire and blade. Elizabeth wore it with the lessons of her past engraved into her, the silence of the Tower, the suspicion of her childhood, the blood of her mother. She knew that England's survival depended not on her womb but on her wits. By refusing to be anyone's wife, she became everyone's queen. In that refusal lay the foundation of her myth, the legend of the Virgin Queen, a legend that protected her throne as surely as any fortress of stone. It was a gamble, a defiance of convention that risked scandal but gained sovereignty. For Elizabeth, the crown was never just ornament, it was calculation, performance and mask. And in those early days of her reign, she set the stage for a life where her body would never be simply her own, but always a theatre where power and myth performed their most dangerous play. If you enjoyed this moment, leave a comment with the number 1 below so I know you're still here with me. Elizabeth's refusal to marry at first, a pragmatic calculation, soon crystallised into something far larger than personal choice. It became a doctrine, a living theology written not in scripture, but in silk paint and ritual. Where her father had broken with Rome by force, Elizabeth built her new order through performance. She did not need a pope to sanctify her, poets, painters and preachers would do it for her. And they did tirelessly. The language of court poets transformed her singleness into purity, her childlessness into eternity. They compared her to Astrea, the virgin goddess of justice returned to earth to restore a golden age. She was Cynthia, the moon untouched, reflecting divine light. To her subjects she was no longer merely a queen, but a celestial body in orbit above politics. Sermons echoed this imagery from pulpits across the land. Elizabeth, as the bride of her people wedded to the realm itself, her chastity proof that God had sanctified the Protestant settlement. Virginity, once a cause for dynastic anxiety, became a pillar of national identity. Portraits carried the message even further. No image was accidental. In painting she appeared with her pearls, symbols of purity draped across her neck and gown. Artists smoothed away imperfections, erasing time wrinkles or weakness. Her face became ageless, a mask of porcelain. Behind her often shone symbols of dominion globes, suns, ships unfurling their sails. The personal body of Elizabeth blurred into the body politic of England. To gaze upon her was to gaze upon the nation itself immaculate and unconquered. Pageantry amplified the myth with fire and music. Coronation anniversaries, royal entries and seasonal festivals were staged as grand theatres of loyalty. When Elizabeth rode through London on progress, the towns transformed themselves into altars. Arches of flowers crowned the streets, choirs of children dressed as angels recited verses comparing her to Deborah, Judith, and the Virgin Mary herself. Each performance was both spectacle and reassurance. The Queen was strong, untouched, eternal. In a world where rumours of illness or infertility could unsettle an empire, these festivals acted as ritual technologies to banish doubt. The public saw what it needed to believe not a woman aging and weary, but a goddess radiant with divine sanction. Even her speeches were imbued with mythic tone. When she declared herself married to England, it was not a metaphor for court poets alone, it became a national creed. Her body, no longer a contested vessel of airs, was consecrated as the altar upon which Protestant England had been reborn. Every refusal of a suitor became a kind of liturgy, every public appearance a sermon on sovereignty. This myth was not accidental. It was policy. Elizabeth understood, perhaps better, than any monarch before her, that power required symbols as much as soldiers. The Armada would be defeated not only by storms and cannon fire, but by the image of a queen in armour at Tilbury. Parliament would be steered not only by law, but by the memory of her honeyed speeches performed with calculated humility. The court itself became a stage where Elizabeth played the dual role of monarch and deity, human and myth. Yet behind the celestial imagery lay necessity. The Tudor throne had been born of contested legitimacy. Elizabeth, child of an executed queen and a schismatic king, knew her dynasty's roots were shallow. To survive, she had to transform fragility into sacredness. By turning her virginity into doctrine, she silenced questions about heirs and lineage. By embodying England itself, she ensured that to oppose her was to oppose the nation. Her body ceased to be her own. It was national metaphor, a vessel for meaning that bound together a fractured realm. Thus the Virgin Queen was not simply a symbol created by others. She was an invention she embraced, manipulated and performed. To look upon her was to look upon England sanctified. and as long as that mask held doubts about bloodlines, illnesses, or weaknesses could be exiled from the stage, the goddess had been made and the myth became the crown's most enduring armour. Step beyond the gilded halls into the Queen's privy chamber, and you find another kind of armoury, one not forged of steel but of powder, lace and whalebone. Here Elizabeth's attendants prepared her body not for battlefields but for audiences, councils and ambassadors. The ritual was intimate, almost sacred, layer upon layer, applied until the woman was transformed into the myth, and in that transformation lay both her strength and her peril. The process often began with ceruse, a cosmetic paste made from white lead and vinegar. Applied to the face, neck and hands, it created a flawless, ghostly pallor that courtly culture prized as the mark of purity. To her subjects, Elizabeth's luminous complexion became a sign of incorruptibility, the outward proof of her inward chastity. Yet beneath that sheen lay danger. Physicians of the age sometimes muttered about the substance's corrosive effects, but their warnings carried little weight against fashion and politics. Modern science now confirms what whispers could only suspect: lead seeped through pores, eroding the skin, poisoning the blood. The very paint that preserved her image was over decades dismantling her flesh from within. Wigs and perukes concealed another secret. In later years, Elizabeth's natural hair thinned, whether from age stress or the toxic burden of cosmetics. To appear diminished would invite whispers of weakness, so artisans crafted elaborate wigs, often flame red in memory of her youthful locks. These constructions were architectural, carefully curled, adorned with pearls or ribbons, sometimes heavy enough to cause headaches. They were crowns in themselves, symbols of vitality worn over the silence of decline. Perfumes and pomanders masked more than odour. In an era when disease and rot lingered in the very air, fragrance was thought protective, almost medicinal. Elizabeth surrounded herself with scents of rosewater, lavender and exotic imports from the East. Yet the sweet haze also served another purpose: to veil the staleness of illness, to reassure courtiers that their queen was radiant even when fatigue shadowed her body. The nose as much as the eye was trained to believe in the mask. Then came the corset whalebone stays, laced so tightly they reshaped the body into a vision of majesty. The stiffened torso projected control, elegance, command. In public, Elizabeth's posture never faltered. She stood as if sculpted in marble, unmoved by age or pain. But the corset, for all its symbolism, was also a vice. Over decades, the pressure compressed ribs, strained muscles, and likely left bruises and sores. What it offered in poise, it demanded back in suffering. The body beneath the silk was not a statue, but a battlefield of slow abrasions and breathless strain. Every element of this ritual was double-edged. The paint exalted and poisoned, the wigs concealed and burdened, the perfume sweetened and suffocated, the stays uplifted and crushed. Together they fashioned a queen who appeared timeless, untouchable, divinely ordained. And yet in private they were chained, silent, daily costs paid in skin, breath and blood. Elizabeth knew this, but she also knew the alternative. To appear frail, blemished or diminished was to invite the vultures of faction and rumour. Better to pay the hidden price than expose the mortal truth. In her chamber she donned not only lace and lead, but armour, the only kind that could protect a woman who ruled in a world of men. Her body became a canvas where politics painted purity, and a cage where history collected its toll one silent day at a time. Thus, beneath the splendour of her portraits and the brilliance of her festivals, a slow reckoning advanced in secret. Each smile on the balcony, each stride through council was purchased by invisible suffering. The Virgin Queen shone, but the woman beneath endured the grind of her own disguise. The mask held, but the cost was already mounting. In the public imagination, Elizabeth never aged. Her face, frozen in perpetual youth, floated across Europe on vellum, parchment and canvas. But this was no miracle of nature, it was the result of policy carefully orchestrated by the crown and executed by the brush. The so-called Mask of Youth was not just a cosmetic trick in her chamber. It was a visual strategy, a state instrument as vital as any treaty or sword. By the 1590s, Elizabeth was in her 60s, weary from decades of rule. Yet the portraits that hung in noble halls and foreign embassies showed a woman untouched by time, smooth, pale skin, flame-red hair, eyes clear as glass. The effect was deliberate. Workshops under court painters such as Nicholas Hilliard and later Isaac Oliver developed patterned faces templates of eternal youth that could be copied and distributed, ensuring uniformity. Whether the Queen sat for the artist or not hardly mattered. What mattered was consistency. Every Elizabeth was the same Elizabeth, the immortal goddess of Protestant England. Iconography carried coded messages of power. Pearls glistened on her gowns, and in her hair symbols of chastity. The sun appeared behind her, or embroidered on her bodice, signifying divine radiance. Globes lay beneath her hands, signalling dominion across seas. Eyes and ears embroidered into dresses proclaimed omniscience. In the Armada portrait, her hand rests confidently upon a globe, her ships triumphant behind her, an image less of a woman than of a mythic force steering England's destiny. These were not portraits in the modern sense. They were visual sermons, each element a verse in the liturgy of monarchy. Reality was softened, erased, even censored. Artists who dared capture the truth of age wrinkles, thinning hair, sunken eyes found their work suppressed. Some were ordered destroyed, others simply disappeared into the private shadows of archives. Courtiers quickly learned that a flattering hand was safer than a faithful one. The Crown's agents managed the Queen's likeness with vigilance, ensuring that no image of frailty could circulate and become fodder for foreign or domestic enemies. In a world where paintings were political weapons, an unflattering portrait was as dangerous as a rebellion. This censorship reveals how thoroughly Elizabeth's body had become a national metaphor. Her subjects did not see her decline because they were not allowed to. They saw instead a vision constructed for them, eternally youthful, eternally sovereign. To question her face was to question the stability of England itself, and so the brush became a tool of statecraft painting, not truth, but permanence. For Elizabeth, this visual control was survival. She had endured childhood disgrace, her sister's prisons, and the suspicion of a divided realm. Now in her later years she faced a new enemy, time. But time could be managed if the image was managed. Her portraits became masks of state extensions of the same discipline she practiced in the Tower, the same cosmetics she wore in her chamber. They allowed her to rule not as an aging woman, but as an icon beyond age. Thus the art of lying with brushes was not a deception born of vanity alone. It was policy as strategic as marriage negotiations or military campaigns. The Queen's face became a battlefield where truth and necessity collided, and propaganda triumphed. Elizabeth's reign was never lived in solitude. Beyond her palaces, beyond the painted masks and embroidered symbols, enemies circled like wolves. Chief among them was Mary Stuart, Mary Queen of Scots, her cousin, her mirror and her shadow. Where Elizabeth embodied Protestant England, Mary embodied Catholic legitimacy. To many across Europe, Mary was the rightful heir of Henry VII's bloodline, unsullied by schism. To the Pope, she was a queen betrayed by heretics. To Catholic factions within England, she was a banner waiting to be unfurled. Every time Elizabeth appeared radiant in procession, Mary loomed behind the image, a darker double, the alternative monarch waiting in the wings. Their contest was not merely personal, it was theological. Elizabeth's virginity was proclaimed as divine proof of Protestant purity, but Mary's motherhood, she bore a son James, was proof of Catholic fertility, continuity and strength. Elizabeth's empty cradle was Mary's weapon. The people might cheer Elizabeth in London, but in whispers and secret chapels others prayed for her cousin's triumph. This rivalry became the stage upon which Europe watched the future of England unfold. The threats were constant and unnerving. Papal bulls declared Elizabeth illegitimate, releasing her subjects from obedience. Plots multiplied: the Ridolfi plot, the Throckmorton plot, the Babington plot, each weaving together Catholic conspirators, foreign ambassadors and whispers of invasion. Spain loomed across the sea. France calculated at its borders, and even within her own council chambers, Elizabeth had to weigh who was truly loyal. Each discovery of conspiracy left her more wary, more determined to master the art of ambiguity. And yet while the world threatened from without, her own body threatened from within. Ambassadors ever observant noted the signs that courtiers dared not speak aloud. Reports spoke of her sudden fatigue of headaches that left her withdrawn, of fevers that rose and fell without warning. Some described her complexion as wan, her frame thinner than in years past. To them these were not private inconveniences, but potential cracks in the edifice of monarchy. If the Queen was ill, if she was aging, then perhaps God's favour was departing too. In the 16th century, the body of the monarch was read like scripture, symptom as omen, pallor as prophecy. Elizabeth, however, understood the stakes. She never admitted to weakness. Every time her health faltered, she summoned the choreography that had kept her alive since childhood. Festivals were arranged, progresses, staged portraits commissioned. If she was pale, she appeared in brighter silks. If she was weary, she leaned on the rhythm of speeches crafted to inflame loyalty. The people saw only the goddess. The mortal woman remained locked behind layers of paint lace and ritual. The braiding of these two narratives, the threat of Mary beyond and the decline within, reveals the precariousness of her sovereignty. One wrong step in either sphere could unravel all. To fall ill publicly would embolden Catholic rebels. To show weakness politically would invite foreign invasion. Thus Elizabeth perfected her lifelong art to smile when exhausted, to dazzle, when in pain to appear eternal, even as her body whispered of mortality. Mary of Scots would ultimately fall to the axe in 1587, her execution both triumph and torment for Elizabeth, who knew too well the price of being a daughter of the scaffold. But even after her rival's death, the deeper contest remained not Mary versus Elizabeth, but time versus image mortality versus myth. And in that battle, Elizabeth fought with every mask she could summon, while her enemies abroad and her own body conspired against her in silence. The summer of 1588 was a season when England's fate seemed balanced on the edge of a blade. Across the Channel, Philip V of Spain had loosed the Armada, a floating fortress of galleons bristling with cannon, carrying thousands of soldiers and priests sworn to return England to Rome. For weeks rumour churned through taverns and marketplaces, fleet-sighted sails swelling like storm clouds. Fear gripped the countryside, yet expectation grew as well. If ever there was a moment for a monarch to embody the spirit of the realm, it was now. Elizabeth answered with theatre and steel. She rode to Tilbury, where soldiers assembled to repel a feared invasion, and appeared before them not as a cloistered queen, but as a commander. Her gown of silk gleamed beneath a breastplate of polished armour, her small frame magnified by the symbols she carried. The moment was pure alchemy, the frail human body transformed into a living icon. Before thousands of men hardened by campaign, she declared that she had the body of a weak and feeble woman, but the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too. The word sword carried by the salt air and the roar of her troops' acclamation. This speech became immortal almost the instant it was spoken. Courtiers recorded it, ambassadors relayed it, poets wove it into verse. The image of the Virgin Queen in armour galloped across Europe, confounding the Catholic monarchs who had long dismissed her as an illegitimate daughter and barren pretender. Here was no hesitant woman, but a sovereign fused with her nation, a queen who could ignite courage in the marrow of men. Even centuries later, the vision of Elizabeth at Tilbury endures half historical, half mythic a monarch, as both warrior and goddess. Yet what history rarely shows is what followed after the crowds dispersed. Behind the closed doors of her chamber, the armour was unbuckled, the silk disrobed. The queen who had stood unshaken before her army sank into exhaustion. She was nearly 55, her body already bearing the hidden scars of years of paint, corsetry and strain. Chronic pains and fevers long suppressed demanded their toll in solitude. Those closest to her, maids, physicians, counsellors, wars, saw the trembling hands, the weary eyes, the private collapse. But none dared record it. The mask of Tilbury had to remain untarnished. The contrast is stark. In public, Elizabeth projected in vulnerability a body that was both England's shield and God's chosen vessel. In private, she bore the fatigue of one who had carried her realm on her shoulders since youth. The courage seemed effortless, but it was not. It was rehearsed, disciplined, carved from a lifetime of surviving suspicion and captivity. To speak like a king while dressed in silken armour was not instinct, it was performance honed to perfection. The Armada was scattered by storm and cannon fire, England saved from conquest. Elizabeth's reputation soared. She became for her people the embodiment of divine favour. Yet in the echo of that triumph lay the hidden truth. Every image of strength was purchased at a price. Behind every immortal portrait, every gilded procession, there was a body quietly unravelling, hidden by layers of paint and silence. Tilbury was victory, but it was also another tightening of the mask, another act of will that bound Elizabeth's flesh to the myth that would outlive her. The Queen had promised her soldiers that she would lay down her life among them, my honour and my blood, even in the dust. In truth, she had already begun to lay it down, not in a single heroic moment, but in a long, unseen surrender to the costs of being both woman and symbol, steel and silk, mortal and eternal. Elizabeth's reign was not only a triumph of power, it was a triumph of silence. Around her grew a machinery of secrecy carefully tended and ruthlessly enforced. Her ladies-in-waiting, those who dressed her, tended her, and watched her tremble in private, learned early that their loyalty was measured not by their devotion alone, but by their discretion. To serve the Queen was to guard a secret. A dropped word about a sleepless night, a whispered remark about a bleeding gum, or a fainting spell could travel from chamber to corridor, from corridor to council, and end in the hands of foreign ambassadors. Silence was not courtesy, it was survival for them and for her. Physicians too walked a dangerous line. Their role was to observe, treat and reassure, but never to expose. Bound by duty and fear, they became participants in a vast masquerade. They might see the corrosive marks left by cosmetics, the tremors of fatigue, or the lingering fevers that sapped her strength, but their tongues were tied. To speak openly was to threaten the stability of the crown itself. Their remedies were offered discreetly. Their diagnoses were smoothed into bland assurances. They served not only their queen's health, but her myth ensuring that the body politic never glimpsed the fragility of the body human. Court life reinforced this choreography. Every mask, every progress, every banquet was staged to banish doubt. The queen entered radiant, her silks shimmering, her face lit by candlelight and cosmetics. Music and poetry swirled around her like protective veils. Even when her steps faltered, the performance compensated, trumpets flourished, courtiers bowed low, ambassadors were dazzled into blindness. What mattered was not how Elizabeth felt, but how she appeared. The pageant of health was itself a state policy, a weapon deployed as effectively as armies or fleets. Yet truth still leaked through the cracks, never openly, but in whispers and coded lines. Foreign ambassadors wrote carefully phrased reports. The Queen seemed somewhat altered in complexion today, or she does not tarry long in the dance as once she did. Phrases that appear polite to modern eyes were daggers in diplomatic cipher warning their masters abroad of possible weakness. Letters carried across the Channel described lingering infirmities or sudden indispositions. Each tremor of the Queen's body was weighed against the balance of nations. If Elizabeth faltered, Spain might strike France, might scheme Catholics within might rise, and yet for every rumour whispered. The official image was louder. The government suppressed unflattering likenesses just as it managed ceremonies to proclaim vigour. The people saw their Queen illuminated by torchlight, lifted by poetry, cloaked in majesty. They did not see the feverish nights, the corsets biting into tired flesh, the hours spent seated in shadows when pain dulled her voice. The mask was never dropped in public. Only those closest to her knew how fragile the performance had become. This court of silence was itself a kind of theatre. Each actor knew their role, attendants as guardians, physicians as accomplices, musicians and poets as scene builders, even ambassadors as unwilling spectators. Elizabeth was both actress and director, orchestrating a play in which the kingdom itself was the audience. And the play had only one allowable plot, the Queen eternal, untouched, unyielding. The cost of this secrecy was immense, but the stakes were higher still. In a kingdom born from schism, surrounded by Catholic enemies, ruled by a woman without heir, doubt was poison. Better to mask the truth, better to train a court in sequence than to let that poison seep into the realm. Thus the machinery endured, running like clockwork, the official pageant of health. On one side the whispered letters of doubt, on the other. Between them stood Elizabeth, half woman, half myth, sustained by the silence of those who lived in her shadow. The winter of 1602-1603 settled over England like a shroud, and within Richmond Palace its chill seeped into the Queen's chamber. The woman who had once commanded the roar of Tilbury now resisted even the whisper of her own bed. Night after night Elizabeth stood upright, her frame rigid, her eyes wide open as though sleep were a snare set by death itself. Attendants pleaded with her to rest, to surrender to the mattress, but she would not. She sank into cushions only to rise again, pacing, staring into corners as though shadows were conspirators. To lie down, she told them, was to give herself over, and Elizabeth Tudor had never been one to surrender. The court recorded fragments enough to sketch but never to define. Ambassadors heard of a queen who drifted between lucidity and vision. One moment she murmured fragments of psalms in Latin, her voice trembling like candlelight. The next she spoke to figures no one else could see. Her laughter startled her maids, brittle and sudden, collapsing into weeping as swiftly as it came. Some said she saw her mother Anne Boleyn, standing silently at the edge of her bed. Others claimed she raved at phantoms of those executed in her name. Legend thickened around the reality, for the silence of courtiers always invited the embroidery of rumour. What we do know is this: the mask she had worn so long began to crack. The cosmetics once applied daily to preserve the illusion of eternal youth now clung uneasily to skin marked by sores and discoloration. Washing her face stripped away not just paint but flesh, revealing a body betrayed by years of leaden labour. Beneath the heavy wigs her scalp was tender hair thinned almost to absence. The corsets once her proud armour pressed cruelly into a body weakened and inflamed. What the portraits denied the chamber revealed an ageing monarch, undone by the very instruments that had once secured her myth. Yet even here theatre endured. Candles multiplied in her chamber, casting her silhouette upon the velvet curtains. Maids arranged her robes with as much care as if she were attending council. In her last weeks, Richmond Palace became a stage set for a performance no audience would ever admit to watching. Elizabeth herself seemed aware of it. She clutched at her dignity, rising when her legs failed, insisting upon presence, even as her body slipped toward absence. Every act of defiance was one more rehearsal in the lifelong drama of concealment. But the silence of the room was louder than any proclamation. Courtiers moved softly, their faces drained of expression. Physicians whispered in corners, powerless to heal, terrified to speak. Outside rumours coiled. Was the Queen bewitched? Was her decay divine punishment? Was England's golden age rotting before their eyes? Inside only the crackle of fire and the rustle of fabric accompanied her decline. Elizabeth's chamber in that winter was both prison and theatre confessional and stage. She had spent a lifetime mastering the art of masks, and now the mask itself trembled. Between the lines of record and the shadows of legend, one truth emerges. The Queen who made a nation believe in her immortality was forced at last to face her mortality. The spectacle of Richmond was not simply a monarch's death, it was the unmaking of a myth, unravelling in the dim light of a winter no servant dared to describe too clearly. When the last breath finally left Elizabeth's lips in March of 1603, Richmond Palace fell into a silence heavier than any anthem. The Queen who had filled England with speeches and spectacles passed into stillness, and her attendants trembling began the solemn work of preparing her body. Candles were lit in greater number, flooding the chamber with trembling light. Curtains were drawn against the dawn. Perfumed waters were brought forward, rose, lavender and vinegar, to mask the odours that inevitably rose once the struggle of life had ended. The ritual was both sacred and political. To tend the corpse of a sovereign was to preserve not only dignity but myth. They removed her jewels first, then the heavy silks that had weighed upon her even in decline. One by one the garments were peeled away until the body of the woman remained no longer the goddess of portraits, but a figure marked by the long war between flesh and performance. What the attendants saw in those first moments became the seed of centuries of speculation. Some later whispered of ulcerations hidden beneath layers of fabric of sores, corroded by cosmetics of skin, poisoned by sour lead paint applied daily for decades. Others spoke of the cruel legacy of the corset of ribs, compressed of bruises, that lingered like shadows upon her torso. But here we must tread carefully between rumour and what can be reasonably inferred. Lead-based ceruse used daily could indeed cause damage, skin lesions, discoloration and systemic illness. Physicians of her time lacked the vocabulary to diagnose poisoning, but modern science suggests that chronic use would have left its mark. Corsets of whalebone and iron, stays worn tightly for years, could bruise, restrict breathing and deform the body, though the most lurid tales of grotesque collapse belong more to imagination than evidence. What is certain is that Elizabeth's attendants found a body aged by 70 years of strain, illness and ceremony. The rituals of preparation sought to overwrite these realities. Attendants washed her gently with scented waters, anointed her skin and covered her in linen. Candles blazed around the bed, their smoke mingling with incense in an effort not only to sanctify but to obscure. For in that moment her body was no longer private, it was national property. The sovereign's corpse, if too carefully examined, could destabilise succession, invite whispers of divine disfavour, or even embolden Catholic enemies abroad. Silence was part of the ritual as essential as any hymn, and so the room became a crucible of contradiction. Those who tended her body saw the truth, the marks of age, the hidden toll of years spent beneath layers of paint and silk. Yet they also participated in the first act of concealment. What they whispered in private letters or in trembling confidences differed from the image proclaimed to the nation. To the world, Elizabeth had died peacefully radiant, even in death. To those inside the chamber, the image required labour, perfumes, candles, and the disciplined refusal to describe too much. Thus began the double life of Elizabeth's corpse relic, to some ruin to others. Between protocol and rumour, between embalming perfumes and whispered accounts of poisoned skin, the Queen's body became contested ground, and as attendants folded her hands and drew a veil over her face, They knew that what they hid in that room would echo for centuries. The hours after Elizabeth's death were not given to mourning but to management. Richmond Palace, once filled with music and progresses, became a workshop of control. The Queen's body, still fragile from the handling of her attendants, was swiftly encased not only in linen and velvet, but in decisions made at the highest levels of state. A coffin was prepared lined with heavy lead. This was no ordinary precaution. Lead sealed out air, slowed decay, and more importantly sealed out curiosity. Once shut, it could not easily be opened without deliberate desecration. In an age when corpses were read like texts, the choice of a lead coffin was as much censorship as protection. The sealing was done with unusual haste. Perfumes and incense had already battled the first hints of odour, but the council knew scent was not the true danger. The true danger was sight. If too many eyes lingered on Elizabeth's body, too many mouths might begin to speak. Ulcerations, discolorations, even the faintest suggestion of deformity could be transformed by rumour into signs of God's disfavour. In Protestant England, where legitimacy was still fragile, that risk was intolerable. Better to lock the body away before the nation or its enemies abroad could seize upon it. The council and the church moved as one. Preachers were instructed to frame Elizabeth's death as serene her passage, as noble her image, as unbroken. Sermons emphasised her long service, her marriage to her people, her victories over Spain. No mention was made of fevers, sores, or delirium. The narrative was polished until it gleamed England's virgin queen had departed in peace, leaving behind a realm stable and blessed. Councillors sent letters abroad in the same key, repeating the message until it drowned out whispers. Why such urgency? Because in Reformation Europe, a monarch's body was never only a body. It was a text read by allies and enemies alike, interpreted as divine commentary on the justice of their rule. A king struck by sudden illness might be seen as punished for heresy. A queen's infertility could be wielded as proof of God's wrath. Bodies were theology made flesh. Elizabeth's corpse, therefore, was a battlefield. To Catholics, any sign of corruption would prove that her reign had been illegitimate, that her defiance of Rome was cursed. To Protestants, her unbroken image was evidence of divine favour, a final vindication of the Church of England. The speed of the sealing, then, was strategy. The lead did more than preserve it erased. It denied Catholic polemicists the spectacle of decay. It denied gossip-mongers the chance to compare her death to her life. The coffin became both tomb and fortress époque, safeguarding not only a body but a myth. And so Elizabeth's death did not end her performance, it extended it. The woman was gone, but the Virgin Queen lived on, embalmed in rhetoric, sealed in lead, and raised into legend by the very act of concealment. Her corpse was hidden, her story proclaimed. What the eye could no longer see, the sermon and the portrait declared. Elizabeth had died as she had lived, untouched, eternal, an icon forged not by flesh but by narrative. The hours after Elizabeth's death were not given to mourning but to management. Richmond Palace, once filled with music and progresses, became a workshop of control. The Queen's body, still fragile from the handling of her attendants, was swiftly encased not only in linen and velvet, but in decisions made at the highest levels of state. A coffin was prepared lined with heavy lead. This was no ordinary precaution. Lead sealed out air, slowed decay, and more importantly sealed out curiosity. Once shut, it could not easily be opened without deliberate desecration. In an age when corpses were read like texts, the choice of a lead coffin was as much censorship as protection. The sealing was done with unusual haste. Perfumes and incense had already battled the first hints of odour, but the council knew scent was not the true danger. The true danger was sight. If too many eyes lingered on Elizabeth's body, too many mouths might begin to speak. Ulcerations, discolorations, even the faintest suggestion of deformity could be transformed by rumour into signs of God's disfavour. In Protestant England, where legitimacy was still fragile, that risk was intolerable. Better to lock the body away before the nation or its enemies abroad could seize upon it. The council and the church moved as one. Preachers were instructed to frame Elizabeth's death as serene her passage, as noble her image, as unbroken. Sermons emphasised her long service, her marriage to her people, her victories over Spain. No mention was made of fevers, sores, or delirium. The narrative was polished until it gleamed England's virgin queen had departed in peace, leaving behind a realm stable and blessed. Councillors sent letters abroad in the same key, repeating the message until it drowned out whispers. Why such urgency? Because in Reformation Europe, a monarch's body was never only a body. It was a text read by allies and enemies alike, interpreted as divine commentary on the justice of their rule. A king struck by sudden illness might be seen as punished for heresy. A queen's infertility could be wielded as proof of God's wrath. Bodies were theology made flesh. Elizabeth's corpse, therefore, was a battlefield. To Catholics, any sign of corruption would prove that her reign had been illegitimate, that her defiance of Rome was cursed. To Protestants, her unbroken image was evidence of divine favour, a final vindication of the Church of England. The speed of the sealing, then, was strategy. The lead did more than preserve, it erased. It denied Catholic polemicists the spectacle of decay. It denied gossip-mongers the chance to compare her death to her life. The coffin became both tomb and fortress, safeguarding not only a body but a myth. And so Elizabeth's death did not end her performance. It extended it. The woman was gone, but the Virgin Queen lived on, embalmed in rhetoric sealed in lead and raised into legend by the very act of concealment. Her corpse was hidden, her story proclaimed. What the eye could no longer see the sermon and the portrait declared, Elizabeth had died as she had lived, untouched, eternal, an icon forged not by flesh but by narrative. The moment Elizabeth breathed her last, another story had to begin. Death may have silenced the Queen, but it could not be allowed to silence the state. Messengers rode out with speed, their saddlebags heavy, not with grief but with scripts, letters, proclamations and instructions that transformed uncertainty into continuity. Before the people could wonder who ruled them, now the answer was already written. James VI of Scotland was James I of England. The union of crowns was declared not as compromise, not as negotiation, but as inevitability, the seamless will of God and history. In truth, it was anything but seamless. Elizabeth had died childless, the Tudor line extinguished with her. The throne might have fractured under rival claimants, Catholic sympathisers rallying around descendants of Henry VII's elder daughter, foreign princes who were eager to marry dynastic right with military power. But these fissures were hidden beneath proclamations polished in advance. James was not introduced as an outsider or a Scottish interloper. He was framed as Elizabeth's natural heir, the son of her narrative, if not her body. The Virgin Queen, eternal in myth, had prepared a path for him. Even in silence she seemed to consent. Councillors and preachers alike understood the stakes. To question succession was to invite civil war, or worse, a return to Catholic domination. By preserving Elizabeth's image intact, her virginity as sacred, her reign as divinely favoured, they preserved the Protestant settlement she had established. If Elizabeth had ruled as God's chosen, then surely God had arranged for James to inherit her mantle. Continuity was not only political, it was theological. To preserve her mask was to preserve the Church. The corpse meanwhile vanished from public sight. Once sealed in lead, Elizabeth's body ceased to matter. The people were not invited to dwell on her decay. Their gaze was redirected toward proclamation ceremonies and the rising image of their new king. The Virgin Queen had been transformed into a symbol so potent that her physical remains could be hidden away without protest. The polity endured because the person disappeared. James himself leaned heavily on the fiction of inevitability. His letters to the English council spoke of obedience to divine providence, of a smooth and natural union of realms. When he entered England, his progress southward was staged as a triumphal march, not the nervous arrival of a foreigner, but the homecoming of a long-prepared sovereign. The people, still awash with grief, were soothed by the narrative. Their beloved Elizabeth had left them not in chaos but in continuity. She had not failed them even in death. This was the genius and the cruelty of the story woven around her. By preserving the myth of Elizabeth intact, England was able to bury the reality of her final decline. Her body could rot in silence because her image still stood bright as ever on the banners that welcomed James. The Virgin Queen did not die, she was transfigured into precedent, into justification, into a bridge that carried the Tudor polity into Stuart hands. Thus the succession was not merely the crowning of a new king, it was the preservation of a narrative. Elizabeth's silence, her sealed coffin, her carefully curated myth allowed James to inherit a throne without bloodshed. Her body disappeared and the state survived. In the end, England's greatest inheritance was not her flesh nor her heirs, but the mask she left behind. The afterlife of Elizabeth's body did not unfold in marble or bone, but in paper-inked lines that travelled clandestine routes, changed hands in smoky chambers, and slept for centuries in cedar chests and chancery bundles. Once the lead coffin was sealed, and the funeral pageant dispersed the crowd, the Queen's flesh passed out of sight. Its meanings, however, multiplied. The body became an archive dispersed across Europe, ambassadorial dispatches, household memoirs, closet sermons, sly libels, and much later the measured queries of antiquarians. Each wrote a different Elizabeth, one to consolidate order, one to sell scandal, one to prove a doctrine, one to unmask it. And between them stretched the most revealing text of all, silence. The first voices to speak were the foreign secretaries. In Madrid, Paris and Rome, envoys had long been trained to read a sovereign's complexion like a ledger. Their dispatches today, the Queen appeared wan. She does not dance as once her hand shook, are careful, bloodless and lethal. They did not dare write the paint cracked or a sore bled through lace, but their euphemisms cut cleanly. The reports were then recopied, coded and summarized for the desks of kings who understood that illness could be opportunity. In their margins one still finds small marks, exclamation pricks, pointing hands, silent signals that someone somewhere considered the Queen's pallor a hinge upon which policy might turn. Closer to home, another genre emerged, household testimonies, half memory, half memoir. Ladies who had served in the privy chamber, stewards who had kept the keys, physicians who had stood at the bed's foot, some left fragments decades later, recollections coloured by piety, ambition, or the need to justify their earlier silences. A maid might in widowhood tell a niece that the Queen slept little and ate less, or that the white upon her face came away like shells. A former groom might hint at the cruel grip of stays or the sudden heats that sent her from the hall. These are not records in the formal sense. They are echoes, and like all echoes they distort. Yet their very inconsistencies open a narrow door. One sees what the state tried to erase, not clinical certainty, but the stubborn survival of the body in memory. Sermons fashioned another script. Preachers licensed or not took to pulpits to interpret the Queen's life and death as providence. In England, their cadences rose like scaffolding around the myth of Virgin Queen who had kept the true faith, died in Christian hope, and left a peaceful inheritance. Across the channel their mirrors reversed. She was Jezebel, an usurper struck at last by God's hand. Here the body became an argument, a parable without anatomy. No sores were named, but sores were implied. No autopsy was performed, but verdicts were delivered. Theology in that age did not need evidence, it needed emblematic flesh. Elizabeth's corpse unseen, unexamined served perfectly, because it could not contradict the preacher's point. The libellists worked faster and dirtier. Pamphlets, maleficent and anonymous, seeded alleys and ports with more suggestive narratives. The Queen's mask peeled like rotten bark. Her womb was ash, her hair was a wig to hide the pox. The details shifted with the wind, but the intention was fixed to desacralize the symbol. State officers seized what they could, as they always had with seditious libel, but libel is a weed that thrives on being pulled up, it scatters. If we read these now centuries on, we learn little of the body and much of the appetite that watched it hungry to see a nation's certainty rot. Between the sermons and the libels lay the official papers, a discipline of tidy summaries and entries in strong clerkly hands. The council registers recorded proclamations, warrants, payments to heralds, orders for black cloth and sable trappings. They do not say why the lead coffin was sealed so swiftly. They do not even say that it was. They simply note that sums were disbursed for the funeral according to custom. This is how states write, not to reveal but to proceed. The absence is not oversight, it is an ethic. What is not written cannot be cited, what cannot be cited cannot be weaponized. And so historians centuries later learned to read what is not there. They read the gaps between letters, the delays in reply, the sudden vanishing of names from payment rolls. They learn that an unflattering portrait disappears not by accident, but by a chain of erasures. An artist paid a canvas, reclaimed, a workshop tight-lipped. They search inventories and find many pictures of Her Majesty in the flower of youth, and hardly any with the lines of age. They trace a request for sweet waters rising in the months before March 1603, the procurement of extra wax, the cost of cerements, the hire of additional torchbearers, numbers and nouns that refuse story yet imply it. When generations later antiquarians began to rattle the cupboards of memory, they argued in a new key. Their queries were cooler, their tools less political. What cosmetics were in use? What were the funerary customs for sovereigns? Whence the rumour of lead poisoning? In their pamphlets and club papers, the body gained a second afterlife. Speculative, comparative, footnoted. They tore open other graves, tested other relics, argued about the ethics of royal remains. Yet even they hesitated before Westminster's lead. Requests to open the tomb went out and were refused, some said out of reverence, others out of fear that the icon might not survive the evidence. A tomb can be both sanctuary and archive. A sealed one is a sanctuary because it withholds the archive. The contrast could not be clearer. What the state preserved with obsessive care were the texts that made a polity proclamations, liturgies, portraits multiplied by pattern books. What it suppressed systematically were the materials that might unmake a myth, unflattering likenesses, indiscreet testimonies, or medical particulars. Over time, the preserved becomes the probable, and the suppressed becomes the lurid. Yet between these poles, historians labour. They look for the compromised but credible witness. The ambassador who had no interest in English domestic flattery, the household bill that had no reason to lie, the sermon that betrays anxiety by the very force of its denial. Sometimes the truth surfaces not in a declaration but in a smudge. A secretary's ink blots heavily on the day of a sudden council. A marginal hand adds dombal indisposed to a public diary, a tailor's account, and inserts quietly an unusual quantity of linens for Her Majesty's comfort. It is through such minutiae multiplied and cross-read that the silhouette of the hidden body appears. Not the lurid carcass of libel, not the marble perfection of mask, but the ordinary suffering frame of a woman in her late 60s who worked beyond exhaustion inside a machine of ritual. There is a poignant irony to this chase through paper corridors. Elizabeth, who learned in childhood to survive by withholding, taught the state to do the same. Her self-mastery became institutional habit. The court's silence matured into a culture of redaction, and that culture hardened into national etiquette. The archive we inherit is therefore both abundant and abstinent abundant in the language of triumph, abstinent in the language of flesh. To write her last years is to stitch with invisible thread, and yet the invisibility is not total. When we lay the strata together, dispatch beside diary sermon, beside libel, warrant beside portrait, we feel the pressure of something underneath. We will likely never open the lead to test the lead. We may never reconcile the image and the anatomy, but we can map the politics of remembering that made such reconciliation unlikely. We can say with some confidence that the Queen's face was curated, that her likeness obeyed a pattern of youth, that her attendants practised discretion, not because they were cowards, but because they were citizens of a fragile settlement. We can say that the rumours of poison owe their persistence to a plausible chemistry and an implacable need for moral allegory. We can say that the speed of burial was a speed of message. What does it mean then to read an archive built to mislead by omission? It means accepting that certainty is a luxury denied by policy. It means learning to treat every silence as a sentence with the subject torn out. It means trusting the small witnesses, a payment for carouse heavier than usual, a royal progress shortened without explanation, an ambassador who remarks that Her Majesty did not tarry long in the hall this day. It means reading the margins where truth lacking a podium scribbles. In the end, the most faithful portrait of Elizabeth's last body is not a picture at all but a palimpsest, layers of hands and motives writing over one another, leaving behind shadows of words. The state preserved the myth so that the church settlement could hold and the polity could endure. The corpse disappeared because the country could not afford it. We live with the inheritance of that choice. Our shelves are lined with printed sermons and royal proclamations. Our folders bulge with copies of envoys' letters. Our fingers grow black with the dust of household books. From these we make a woman who is always half in light, half in smoke. Perhaps that is just. It forces us to remember that history is not a window, but a mirror, and that every age chooses what it can bear to see. The lead beneath Westminster has never yielded its commentary, but the papers above it never cease whispering. Between them, between a coffin that refuses and an archive that evades Elizabeth, still governs the story of her own decay, not by decree as in life, but by the grammar of gaps she left behind. Science has spent 2 centuries knocking politely at first, then with growing insistence at the door sealed over Elizabeth's remains. The questions seem on their face clinical. What did the white paint do? What did the corsets cost? Did an unseen tumour whisper the last act? But beneath the laboratory's curiosity lies something older, thornier, a struggle over who owns the past, the living, who study it, or the dead who once commanded it. The lead in Westminster has held, and so science has been turned away, yet the questions have multiplied in the refusal. Begin with the skin. Cerusse Basic lead carbonate was no ordinary cosmetic. Mixed with vinegar to make a paste and smoothed onto face, neck and hands, it produced the coveted pallor of rank. Modern toxicology, unable to reach Elizabeth's bones, has turned instead to period recipes residue on textiles and medical treatises to chart its hazards. Lead absorbed through the skin can disturb multiple systems: neurological fatigue, headaches, tremor, hematologic anemia, renal strain, dermatologic ulceration where the paste fissures living tissue like winter ice. Skeptics note that absorption through intact skin is slow. Advocates counter that decades of daily use applied to irritated or abraded areas accumulate. The truth in the absence of a biomarker from Elizabeth herself is a spectrum of probabilities, but the vector is plausible, especially when paired with other chronic burdens: infection, malnutrition, during episodic fasting, insomnia, weaponized into habit. Then there is the scaffold beneath the gowns, whalebone stays busks, and tight lacings that cinch the torso into sovereignty. Historians have dressed caution against anachronism. The horror stories of crushed ribs and displaced organs belong more to later extremes than to Elizabeth's era. Yet even moderate compression sustained for hours across years has musculoskeletal costs. The intercostal musculature fatigues. The diaphragm's excursion is altered. Shallow breaths become the norm, encouraging stasis, and periodic heats or faintness that courtiers euphemized in their letters. Skin under pressure breaks. Cysts and ulcers form where seams and boning rub. The spine, already fighting the weight of gowns, jewels, and wigsy, learns postures it will later regret. None of this makes for melodrama, it makes for attrition. The armour that projected majesty taught the body to pay in instalments. From here, hypotheses diverge. Some physicians reading The Long Winter at Richmond favour endocrine explanations: possible thyroid dysfunction, manifesting as fatigue, thermoregulatory swings, mood lability, or adrenal exhaustion in a frame that had lived for decades on adrenaline's knife edge. Others propose oncological paths, inferring from hints of hardness and swellings from rumours of suppuration and bandaged sites, the presence of a chronic lesion, breast, uterine, or dermatologic, that the protocols and modesty of the day concealed beneath brocade. A minority suggests chronic infectious processes, dental sepsis, seeding fevers, or an untreated skin infection mismanaged by occlusive cosmetics. None of these can be proved without tissue. All of them are consistent with the archival fog intermittent incapacity punctuated by performances of vigour, a sovereign who could summon lightning in public and then sit long in private shadow. Here science meets ethics at the threshold of stone. Why not open the tomb? Why not answer with a biopsy, a sample, a spectral graph? The refusals repeated across generations come dressed in several reasons, each weighty on its own, together immovable. The first reason is reverence, what curators call the dignity of the dead. Monarchs are not merely persons, they are institutions whose remains have been woven into national ritual. To breach a royal coffin is to jolt an unspoken compact that the bodies which once represented the polity will not be turned into specimens. Museums that unwrapped countless mummies now pause before sovereigns of their own line. It is not only sentiment, it is the intuition that some graves underpin more than biography. The second is conservation. Lead coffins create microclimates. Inside, a delicate equilibrium may have formed among gases, humidity, and organics. Break the seal and corrosion accelerates. Textiles disintegrate in air. Bone dehydrates and flakes. What had been stabilized by centuries of darkness collapses in minutes of light. The act of looking becomes the act of destroying. To learn is to erase. Curators trained by hard experience of opened vaults counsel restraint: the archive you open may be the archive you lose. The third is law and precedent. To authorize one royal exhumation invites petitions for others. If Elizabeth can be tested, why not Henry to settle syphilis rumours? Why not the princes in the Tower to close a national wound? Each case carries its own politics, but approvals echo. Custodians of abbeys and palaces tasked with stewarding memory across centuries fear that a single yes will become a chorus they cannot control. Their no then protects not only one queen, but the entire grammar of royal burial. The fourth is politics of memory. Elizabeth's image, carefully curated in life, canonized in death, still works. She anchors a national story about religious settlement, maritime daring, and the birth of an English identity that later becomes British. To discover, say, metastatic disease or heavy metal accumulation beyond dispute would not shame her. It might even humanize her. But those who guard the tomb hear a different risk that the forensic present will weaponize the past, recoding a sovereign strategy of image as mere vanity or reading bodily failure as theological verdict, exactly the hermeneutic she fought to suppress. In an age of culture wars, bones are conscripted quickly, so science improvises at the edges. Historians of medicine reconstruct recipes and lab test replica cirrus on pigskin. Costume scholars map pressure points on stays and model breath mechanics on volunteers wearing accurate reproductions. Forensic chemists sample trace residues from period textiles with non-destructive techniques coaxing whispers from fibres without plucking them. Imaging advances tempt with promises portable CT for lead coffins, endoscopic cameras through existing cracks. But every proposal returns to the same gatekeepers, and the verdict is familiar. Not this tomb. Not now. There is honesty due here. Science is not an innocent petitioner. It is also a storyteller, and like all storytellers, it has a plot. It loves the revelation that overturns the tale we were told. In the laboratory's imagination, the lead opens, the instrument hums, the numbers bloom on a screen, and history yields at last to measurement. This dream, noble and dangerous, underestimates what myth is for. Myths do not survive because they are true. They survive because they are useful. Elizabeth made herself useful as myth to weld a fractured realm. The church settlement balanced on her image still stands in the national narrative. To ask the body to contradict the story is to ask the nation to negotiate again with the fractures she sealed. And yet ethics has another face. Keeping the tomb closed does not keep her safe from indignity. It keeps her from being known. It preserves a version of consent she never gave silence over a version of truth she perhaps could not afford in life. Some argue that the dead have claims, but the living have duties to knowledge, to transparency, to a history that can bear complexity. They point to other exhumations done with care identifications that gave families closure analyses, that corrected calumnies, insights that refined medicine's history. They ask whether reverence without inquiry is not a second mask, different from hers only in the hands that tie it. Between these positions, the custodians have chosen caution. The refusals are in a sense consistent with Elizabeth's own governance. She learned young that some doors once opened cannot be shut. She ruled by pageant and by paper controlling what could be seen and what could be cited. The sealed coffin is merely the last order issued in her name. Proceed without spectacle. So we make do with the light that will enter. Probability-modelled strain reconstructed ointments, the arithmetic of rumour. We learn to ask better of small things, the invoice for a sudden quantity of carouse, the tailor's notation of soft linens for nightly wear, the ambassador's chilled phrase. Her Majesty was of shorter audience today. We test lead on paper and find it heavy test whalebone on ribs, and find it patient but insistent test the endurance of a woman-made symbol, and find it astonishing. We weigh the occluded endocrine possibilities, the subclinical infections, the tumour that may or may not have been there. And we speak in tenses that honour uncertainty could likely consistent with. Precision without possession becomes our ethic. Science at the door does not retreat. It learns courtesy. It writes the limits into its conclusions, and in doing so names the politics that made those limits. The tomb remains shut. The questions remain open. Perhaps this too is a fitting legacy for a ruler who mastered ambiguity and made it serve a nation. The lab waits. The abbey keeps its vow. Between them, a silence like lead. Above them, a conversation that refuses to end. If one day the seal should break with ritual oversight and a gentleness matched to the centuries, there will be numbers at last. Isotopes and histology spectra and scans. They will not rescue us from interpretation. They will only ask us to revise it. Until then, the most ethical science we can practice is the kind that acknowledges why the door is shut and reads with care the drafts that come under it. What does it cost to turn a person into a policy? Elizabeth's reign answers with receipts itemised in flesh and silence. From the first day she refused a husband to the last night she refused a bed, her survival in England's was secured by a calculus that spent the private woman to bankroll a public myth. The realm needed a body it could read like scripture, incorrupt, tireless, unmarred by the ordinary erosions of time. What it had was a mortal frame. Between need and fact, Elizabeth built a bridge of masks. Each success of her settlement parliament soothed factions restrained. Spain repelled was paid for by another, tightening of that mask, another rehearsal in the art of appearing invulnerable. Policy gathered on her skin. The ceruse that whitened her face did not beautify alone. It sacralized. It turned the body of the Queen into a page on which purity could be painted daily, then presented to a watching realm as proof that the Protestant covenant held. Stays and busks did not sculpt only posture. They erected a visible architecture of self-command. Pageant portrait and sermon braided into a single rope strong enough to pull a trembling kingdom across the ravine of succession. but rope made of images frays where it is handled most. The more those images were needed, the more often they had to be displayed. The more often displayed, the heavier the toll extracted from the body forced to carry them. The court learned to play its part. Ladies-in-waiting became wardens of absence, guarding the queen from being seen except as she must be. Physicians were made curators of belief, prescribing not only tinctures but discretion. Heralds and poets stitched ceremony into armour. When rumours rose about fatigue fevers, failings, progresses grew more splendid, portraits more luminous, sermons more absolute. The programme worked. England's enemies learned to underestimate her at their peril. Her subjects learned to translate her image into assurance. Yet every triumph deepened the pack. The more the nation depended on the mask, the more the woman beneath had to vanish. The pattern is not uniquely Tudor. Other courts have built states on bodies made emblem, and then spent those bodies to keep the emblem bright. Louis XIV turned himself into the sun. Versailles choreographed his waking and sleeping so that France could believe its orbit stable. Roman emperors before him transformed scars and victories into godhood by decree, while vilifying the sick body as omen of a failing age. In Qing China, ritual dress and regulated gesture made the emperor's person a movable altar. In Ottoman Istanbul, the Sultan's invisibility behind screens multiplied his majesty while thinning his humanity to rumour. More darkly, the 20th century learned to weaponize photographs and film so thoroughly that leaders became silhouettes against which truth could not compete. The lesson that recurs is not that Elizabeth resembles these figures in methods or morality, but that power across cultures and centuries develops a hunger for masks once it discovers their use. Masks feed the state because they reduce uncertainty. A ruler who bleeds is a question. A ruler who shines is an answer that can be paraded. In Reformation Europe, where theology read politics from the body and politics read theology from the pulpit, uncertainty was not a discomfort, it was danger. Elizabeth's image therefore did more than flatter. It stabilized. It told Protestants that God smiled on their church. It told Catholics that their arguments had lost the favour of Providence. It told merchants that trade would continue, soldiers, that pay would come, parishioners, that the collect for the Queen could be said without a tremor. The image accomplished what 100 edicts might fail to do. It made a fractured country behave as if it believed itself whole. But stabilization by image makes a further demand fidelity to the image, even when it contradicts the person. The Crown's censorship of unflattering portraits was not simply vanity. It was the enforcement arm of a doctrine that required Elizabeth to be perpetually 29. The swift sealing of the lead coffin was not a morbid flourish. It was the final act of a long policy that forbade the body to comment on the legend it had been made to carry. The result is that the woman who had a mind like wire and a temper like fire left behind not a readable anatomy but a reliquary. The reliquary is moving and useful. It is also an erasure. Victory purchased with silence leaves a particular residue. It is the archive of gaps we inherit, inventories full of suns and pearls but empty of pain, sermons full of providence but mute on pus and phlegm, accounts that list sweet waters and black cloth by the gallon while omitting why they were needed. From these omissions later ages, weave theories lead poisoning corset-damaged tumours because the human need to know rushes to fill the spaces policy cut out. We are tempted to turn the pendulum the other way. If they made her perfect, we will make her pathological. But the cost of being a symbol is more ordinary and more terrible than the lurid extremes allow. It is the attrition of living long under inspection, the slow metamorphosis of person into picture, the quiet substitution of willpower for wellness, until will alone must suffice. There is a gentler register in which to reckon that cost. Think of the child who learned after her mother's beheading that safety depends on stillness. Think of the prisoner in her sister's kingdom practicing the calm that would later pass for serenity. Think of the queen in armour at Tilbury, drawing up the last reserves of a body already taxed by sleepless years. Each scene reads as courage, and it is. Each also reads as rehearsal for an ending, in which rehearsal never stops. When attendants begged the ageing Elizabeth to lie down and she refused, unwilling to yield to posture what she would not yield to policy, she was keeping the bargain she made with England that the symbol would not blink while the nation looked at it. The price was not dramatic in a single stroke. It was paid in coin too small to count another hour without rest, another layer of paint, another stay laced tighter, another portrait signed and sent. To draw parallels is useful only if it keeps us modest. We can recognize in other regimes the same equation's spectacle over scrutiny, continuity over candour without pretending that all masks are the same or all costs identical. The scale and violence differ. The instruments change from brush and brocade to broadcast and algorithm. Yet the appetite persists. Power loves the efficiency of a single untroubled face. Populations weary of complexity often love it too. To look at Elizabeth's age and call it cruel while excusing our own is a form of amnesia the archive does not deserve. There is, however, a counterweight, and it comes from the very discipline that the mask tried to forbid. History trains the eye to notice what spectacle hides. It values the unglamorous witness, a tailor's bill, a maid's aside, an ambassador's bland phrase over the gilded speech. In reading what the state preserved against what it suppressed, historians rebuild imperfectly the person behind the policy. This does not dethrone the symbol, it right-sizes it. It permits us to admire the strategy without denying the suffering that funded it. It allows us to understand why a kingdom needed the Virgin Queen while remembering that a woman bore her. If there is a lesson to gather from the cost of being a symbol, it is not that masks are always lies. Sometimes they are bridges over civil wars between faiths across seasons of fear. The ethical demand is not that we abolish masks, but that we learn to count their price and to ask before we pay it again who must supply the currency. The polity that once demanded Elizabeth's perfection needed her to be more than human. The people who study her now can grant her back the humanity that office subtracted. We cannot open the coffin, perhaps. We can open our method. We can say she hurt where the proclamations were mute. We can say she chose where the libels declared compulsion. We can say she calculated where the hagiographies insisted on miracle. Power will continue to hunger for masks. That is its nature. The dignity we owe the dead and the living is to remember that beneath every successful one there is a face, and faces bruise. Elizabeth taught a nation to survive by image. The nation survived. The image survived. She did too, but at a rate of exchange we can now read in the ledger of whispers and omissions she left behind. To tell the truth about that ledger is not to diminish her, it is to complete the account. And so as we stand once more before the stone that hides the laid that hides the woman, we allow both truths their due. The symbol that steadied a country and the person who paid for it by degrees. England asked for a goddess and was given a queen who could pretend at one until the curtain fell. The applause never stopped. The quiet afterward was hers alone. Beneath the stones of Westminster the lead coffin lies untouched. 4 centuries have passed since it was lowered into darkness, yet it still speaks, though not in words we can hear. It speaks in silence, in the refusal of curators to break the seal, in the caution of clergy who weigh reverence against inquiry, and the hunger of scholars and the fascination of the public. It speaks in the persistence of questions that circle unsatisfied. Was Elizabeth slowly poisoned by her own cosmetics? Did the corsets that upheld her majesty also carve bruises into her skin? Did an unseen illness gnaw at her while she stood radiant in public? The tomb will not answer. It holds its knowledge in lead and shadow. We began with that image, the coffin hidden under heavy stone, a secret preserved by monarchy and myth. We end there too, for the question it poses has never faded. What lies beneath not only the remains of a sovereign, but the residue of choices her own, and her councils, her poets, and her peoples, that turned a human life into a symbol, and then worked to keep the symbol intact. Every nation that has ever depended on a myth has done the same. Elizabeth's story only sharpens the lesson glory demands silence, and silence leaves its scars. For the historian, the refusal to open the tomb is both loss and instruction. Loss because evidence slumbers a few feet away, perhaps waiting to confirm or revise what rumour and reconstruction suggest. Instruction because absence itself is part of the archive. What a state chooses not to show is as telling as what it displays. The lead-lined coffin is thus more than container. It is testimony to how power manages memory, how even in death Elizabeth was commanded to play her part. Yet as we circle her story, we owe her more than curiosity. We owe her empathy. Behind the crown was a woman who had inherited a scaffolded mother, a suspicious sister, a kingdom cracked by schism. She learned to survive by disguise, to rule by spectacle, to embody her country so fully that she could never again belong to herself. That is not only a political achievement, it is a human cost. The myth still shines, but it shines because it was polished with her exhaustion, her fevers, her discipline, her loneliness. And so the coffin rests unanswered. Perhaps it will never be opened, and perhaps that is fitting. For Elizabeth remains what she made herself, a riddle between flesh and image, truth and performance. What lies under stone is not only a body but a debt, a reminder that every myth is written in two inks, one golden, one red. To admire the first without acknowledging the second is to misunderstand the bargain. The call then is simple. Respect evidence when it exists, read silences as carefully as words, and when we encounter myths, whether in portraits in politics or in our own age, remember that they always leave a trace in flesh and time. Elizabeth Tudor the Virgin. Queen lies sealed in lead. Her image endures because she paid the price. The question that remains is whether we, in telling her story, can give her back the dignity of being human as well as sovereign. Beneath the silence of Elizabeth I's sealed coffin lies more than a monarch. It lies a lesson about how humans past and present grapple with power, image and truth. Her story is not only the biography of a queen but the parable of a life transformed into symbol. In preserving the Virgin Queen, England created stability, pride and identity. But it also exacted a price a woman erased behind paint corset sermons and silence. And in that erasure we can recognise truths about our own lives, our own cultures and the ways we too build masks to face the world. The first lesson is that strength often comes at hidden costs. Elizabeth stood in armour at Tilbury, declared herself both woman and king, and gave courage to her soldiers. Yet behind closed doors she trembled with exhaustion. The image saved her kingdom, but the woman beneath suffered. In our lives too, there are times when we project confidence while carrying burdens unseen. This is not hypocrisy, it is survival. But we must remember that constant performance without spaces for vulnerability can erode us from within. Balance is the quiet wisdom her coffin whispers. Resilience must not consume the person it protects. The second lesson is the danger of silence as strategy. Elizabeth's court was trained to conceal her ailments just as official portraits erased her age. That silence preserved stability, but it also robbed her of the right to be human. Today in workplaces, families and even friendships we still mask our weaknesses for fear they will be weaponized. Yet unchecked silence breeds isolation. History reminds us that hiding every trace of pain may protect the image, but it denies others the chance to know us fully, and it denies ourselves the relief of being seen. The third lesson is the endurance of myths. Elizabeth chose not to marry and instead proclaimed herself wedded to her kingdom. That choice, wrapped in poetry and ritual, became the cornerstone of England's identity. But myths, however useful, demand repayment. They ask us to uphold ideals that no person can perfectly embody. In our own time, we too live under myths of success, of perfection, of eternal youth that leave scars when flesh cannot match the image. The lesson is not to abandon ideals, but to hold them gently, with awareness of the humans who must live beneath them. Finally, Elizabeth's story teaches us the power of empathy across centuries. To study her decline is not to revel in decay, but to honour her humanity. She was brilliant, calculating, disciplined, and also tired, lonely and ill. By recognising both sides, we see her not as goddess or ruin, but as a person navigating impossible demands. The same is true for those around us today. Every polished face hides a private struggle. Every mask, however convincing, leaves pressure marks if we look closely enough. Elizabeth I remained sealed in stone, her truths withheld. Yet what her life and death reveal is timeless power needs masks, but people need compassion. The myths we build may stabilize nations or simply help us get through a day, but behind each mask lies a human being who deserves to be remembered whole. And if we learn that, then even a coffin of lead can yield a lesson worth carrying forward. Thank you so much for keeping me company tonight. Don't forget to subscribe so we can share many more stories together.